Hello folks, welcome to Module 7, Science, Technology, and Discovery. This module is going to be divided into two main themes. The first is the Industrial Revolution, which will cover some of the developing science and technology of starting in the late 1700s and then moving on to the 20th century and beyond. And the second part of the module will be primarily about discovery. And there I'm going to focus mostly on the Columbian exchange, the exchange of basically plants, animals, diseases, and technologies between the Americas and the Eurasian and African worlds. All right, so let's start with the Industrial Revolution. Behind me on my guest bed, there's a lot of textiles that I just kind of walked around the house and pulled out. Draped over the edge of the bed is a quilt my great-grandmother made from scraps of fabric, I assume, that had accumulated around her house. The back of the quilt is textiles that were used to make sacks for flour, because they would take grains to the mill and literally have it ground. My grandma, as a girl, would take the horse to the mill, get it ground, put in a sack, bring the sack of meal or flour back. And then these sacks were not thrown away, because textiles were not considered disposable until relatively recently. On top of the quilt, there's a couple of fuzzy blankets that were made. I'm not sure where the fuzzy blankets were made. There's two tablecloths that I got at thrift stores, and on the very top there is a fabric that was made in Indonesia. And the jacket I'm wearing was made in India, and the shirt was made in Bangladesh, and the shirt I also got from a thrift store as well. So how does this happen? How do we have so many textiles? We have blankets, we have pillowcases, we have tablecloths, we have jackets, we have shirts, we have handkerchiefs. And what was like before all of this became available? So let's start with that. So the before times, and by the before times I do not mean before the pandemic, the before times, the majority of humans lived on farms. They were not necessarily self-sufficient, but the material life of people was very, very limited compared to what we have today. Most people would have maybe one or two changes of clothes. They would have something they produced on their farm that they would then exchange for other goods and manufactured goods, like candles and candlesticks, maybe a few simple pieces of furniture. And so there's a very small class of craftspeople and a very small class of merchants that traded things. We've talked about this a little bit in globalization. But the big change that occurred, that changed this mostly rural, very face-to-face, very family-centered and community-centered way of life, was industrialization, and it's often characterized as the Industrial Revolution. In your learning module, you've got several videos to watch, a Khan Academy learning unit to look at, and several web pages that will kind of take you through the basics of the Industrial Revolution. But by various accidents of nature and history, the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain in the mid to late 1700s. So this was not just a technological transformation, but it was also a social and ultimately a political transformation, and really a cultural transformation. The way we look at the world is characterized by industrialization. So if you imagine in the before time that you live on a farm with an extended family, maybe several generations either share a household or live in close proximity to each other. To make a little bit of extra money, you may do what is putting out work. You and your family members may weave or spin or make simple home manufactured items that you then sell to people that come around. So this is how cloth was made. Cloth was actually a very expensive product through most of human history because it's extremely labor intensive. So all of the fibers in the shirt I'm wearing 300 years ago would have to be made by hand on simple devices like spinning wheels or even using a spindle. And so for most of human history, cloth was limited by how much labor you could get. This is why wealthy people would have brilliant robes and brightly colored robes as a sign of status, because the clothes they were wearing represented huge investments of labor. And so you got to show off your status by wearing a fancy robe or a toga. A toga is basically a useless piece of clothing because it's this giant garment that has to be worn in a particular way. You can't do anything. You can't ride a horse. You can't cook a dinner in a toga. A toga is basically a business suit for a wealthy person. But it was a sign of status because it took a lot of labor to make such a thing. So most people did not have access to clothing like this, like a jacket. They would have simple garments, simple cloaks. A shirt would basically be sleeveless or maybe have, very simple sleeves. Pull over the head because making plackets and buttons was also very, very labor intensive. So textiles were this very labor intensive process that were often used to show status between different individuals. But a series of inventions allowed textiles to become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The videos you'll watch will go through them. There was the spinning jenny, and then various machines that were able to spin cotton in particular into finer and finer threads that could be then used for weaving, industrial weaving machines. Now, these machines, of course, require power to make them work. The earliest machines, simple machines, were run by human power. And so the first machines like the spinning jennies were home machines, but it allowed someone at a home, so you could live on a farm, have your farm, and then during parts of the year or parts of the day when it wasn't so busy, you could do some spinning and earn a little bit of extra money by making some spools of thread and then selling them to a person. So a person would come through the villages, pick up the thread, give you some spindles to fill up with thread again. This is, this isn't a great way to run an industry because if the farm's busy or, I get sick, then I'm not going to run my machine. And so then the person buying the thread isn't going to have as much thread as they expected. So then the weavers are not going to have as much thread as they expected. So one of the key facets of industrialization is to create sort of standardized time controlled processes. So getting somebody to do something when they feel like it is not going to be nearly as reliable as to get them to move to a factory and show up at 8 every morning to work on their machine. So that's essentially what happened. As these machines became more sophisticated, as new power sources were developed, then we get the first factories. And these were primarily textile factories. What were the power sources? Well, the earliest power sources were water. Water had been used for centuries to, grind grains. Some industrial processes like mining had used water power for centuries. In mining, ore would come out of the mines and it'd have to be, for metal ores like lead or tin, it would have to be broken up and then put in the furnaces. And so giant hammers were made using water power. But water power wasn't taken advantage of in the same way as it was once these machines were invented. Suddenly, water wheels, which could turn continuously, could be used to power giant looms and giant spinners, which could literally go around the clock. Now, that's right there. That's a big difference from living on a farm and doing a little bit of work when you feel like it. So suddenly, there was the opportunity to create these factories. Where was the labor going to come from? So the labor came from the English countryside. It came from It came from a set of changing social conditions. Before the Industrial Revolution, as one of your videos will mention, there were some changes to agriculture which allowed agriculture to be more productive. So fewer farmers could actually feed large numbers of people. And so the downside of that was that many farmers went out of business, or what really happened was that wealthy individuals began buying up farms because suddenly farming was a practice that could make you rich, which had never been the case in previous eras of human history. So you got this group of landowners buying up more and more farms, finding ways to take over land that had been farmed by small families and had belonged to villages. This was called the enclosures in England, and producing cheap food. So you had people displaced from farms. They would move to cities. They would look for work, and then the factories come along and give them work. Now the factories, because the goal is to maximize profit, the factories would work 12, 14 hours a day. In some cases they would work around the clock. This meant that there were clocks and that people began working according to clocks. So farmers typically work according to the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of their livestock, not according to being somewhere at 9 a.m. and clocking in. So this is the beginning of working according to clock time. So people would have to be at the factory at a certain time. They'd work a certain number of hours. Now the early factories were pretty brutal places to work. And you do have several interactive components of your learning module that will help you get some picture of just how brutal they were. The factories were enormously competitive, and so factory owners were always looking for ways to get more out of their workers. One of the ways to get more out of your workers was to get children to work. And child labor became a big part of the early factory system. The other way, of course, was to get people to work for enormously long periods of time. And since each factory was, trying to produce cheaper cloth than the factory next to it, there was an incentive basically to race to the bottom. If I was not able to produce my fabric cheaper, then I would go out of business, and so I had to be more brutal with my workforce than the person next to me. The other element of this is that industrialization also created, by concentrating labor, by concentrating manufacturing in one place, it created a lot of what's called externalities in modern industry. That is pollution, basically, and waste. The machinery would generate lots of dust, which is toxic to workers, even though, of course, the early authorities are like, nah, it doesn't hurt you to breathe cotton dust all day long. It does hurt you to breathe cotton dust all day long, and people's lifespan seriously declined that worked in these places. Also, you're indoors. Most factory shifts were 12 to 14 hours a day. So you didn't get any sunlight, so therefore you got vitamin D deficiency. The access to food was restricted. So even though food had become cheaper, you didn't get the diversity and the quality that you might have had you lived on a farm or lived in a village. Now, I'm not saying that farm life and village life was easy, but it was definitely healthier, and that's demonstrably the case for factory workers, right? People that lived in the villages and lived on the farms lived longer, had fewer preventable diseases or nutritional diseases. Starting as a factory worker when you were 6 years old, which was not uncommon in industrial England, and then later in the United States, you were often subject to malnutrition. You were subject to the dangerousness of the work. A machine is a pretty unforgiving device to interact with. So often workers would lose fingers, have their hair ripped out, by getting caught in the machinery. People died frequently as well, or were maimed and then unable to work. So the system was pretty brutal, but what came out of it? What came out of it initially was cheap cloth. So why cloth? Because cloth was a status symbol. At the same time, the social transformation was not just the one-way transformation of people moving off the farms. and working into factories, but it creates a whole new class of individuals, the middle class. Now, we've encountered the middle class a little bit when we were talking about Baroque art. The middle class is basically, starts off as the merchant class. These are people that buy and sell and trade things, and also people that work in banks and people that run various types of shops, and so in the Low Countries, in the 1500s and the 1600s, we started to get sort of the beginnings of a middle class. In England, with the Industrial Revolution, we get a huge explosion of the middle class. So these are people that are able to purchase these cheap things that are being made in the factories, and then do things with them like sell them long distances, or import and export materials. And so we get the rise of the middle class. And now the middle class is pretty much a new invention. Once again, the ancient world had nothing like the middle class. For example, in ancient Rome, your options were to be a slave, be very poor, or be enormously unimaginably wealthy, or be even more enormously unimaginably wealthy. There really wasn't a place for the middle class person who owns a house and has their family in their house. And maybe one income that supports this whole family, and you can afford to clothe your children and feed your children, and maybe even send them to nice schools and get them an education so they don't have to work in factories. That's really what the middle class was about. It was this group of people that had access to this new industrial wealth. So industrialization starts with the textile industries. It also starts with coal. So coal had been was a very prevalent, easily accessible resource in England at this time, and wood, which was used to heat homes, was very, very limited. It was limited by how much forest you had. Since wood was used for other things, such as building ships that the English were very, very fond of, and building houses, which everyone needed, wood was always a very limited resource. Coal started getting exploited, used for heating homes, used for making iron and steel. But the problem with coal is that it comes in mines. I come from a coal mining family, and I myself worked in a mine very briefly. And it is so when you go down into mines tend to fill up with water. So coal was limited by the amount of pumping that could be done. So one of the early inventions that becomes really a signature invention of the Industrial Revolution is the steam engine. Now, the steam engine, like most industrial inventions, was not one invention by one brilliant inventor or engineer. It was actually a series of inventions over more than 100 years. So each as problems arose, new inventors would tinker with it and improve it. It starts with an inventor named Slavy, I believe, goes on to Newcomb and Watt. Watt developed a steam engine that was fairly reliable and quite efficient. Steam engines, for most of their history, used coal, and since they were used to pump coal out of coal mine, or water out of coal mines, then they had a cheap source of power for them. But once Watt had developed a very efficient steam engine, then we started seeing steam being used to power factories. And so factories began growing up close to coal mining areas so that the coal can be brought cheaply and easily to the steam engines, which are used to power factories where women and children work for 14 hours a day. The other side of this is that steam engines use a lot of steel, and so this was an impetus to improve steel manufacturing. Steel is very heavy, and to move heavy objects, you might consider inventing a railroad. So all of these inventions kind of come in fairly rapid succession. Over the course of about 3 generations, which is about 100 years or so, we go from a mostly agricultural society with people getting anywhere they go on foot, or on horseback, or in stagecoach to people riding in trains and living in cities and working in factories. So this is a huge transformation, and this is ongoing. So unlike other revolutions, like the American Revolution, which has a specific time frame, the Industrial Revolution is in a lot of ways a continuous revolution. The fact that this shirt was made in Bangladesh, probably in pretty horrific conditions. Bangladesh is known in the last 20 years for being a place where there are textile factories, not like the old factories. These are powered by electricity, but you do have workers working 12-hour days in often these factories that are 5 and 6 stories tall, with hundreds of people working not in giant mechanical machines, but in electronic machines, stitching together cheap clothing that then gets sold around the world. We now consider clothing disposable. This is why I can go to a thrift store and get a decent shirt that fits me well and doesn't have any holes in it, because clothing has become so cheap that it's disposable, from being a prestige item that only the wealthy, would have something nice like a toga or a beautifully dyed robe, to something that a person could buy and wear, as long as it's fashionable, and then get rid of. And part of that is that there is this process to industrialization, where industrialization created, just as initially it starts off in England with this very, very competitive side to it, it continues to have that. Certain forms of industrialization, such as clothing manufacture, tends to be extremely competitive. And so this is why factories might arise in Bangladesh, where people are being terribly exploited to make cheap clothing.